Hey, hey, we're back here at the Nexus User Conference in the Customer Success Strategy track. We added this track because, in general, people, unless they own the Nexus platform or the Nexus product, they don't know what's available as far as customer success and what kind of support we can provide. So I'm going to have Chris Carlucci kick this off. Morning, Chris.
Hey Mark, how you doing?
Doing good. I'm excited about this track. We haven't done this before, that we're actually going to have your whole team virtually
Right.
talk about what they're doing. So I'm excited to hear about that. You want to give us a rundown for what's going to happen today?
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate everyone joining today. I'll be kicking off a series of presentations that's conducted by the SonoType customer success team, as Mark just mentioned, that's going to discuss various aspects of Nexus solutions as well as open source usage and the patterns we see across the various organizations that we work with. And I think you'll see a variety of topics ranging from what makes a successful customer to how to deal with open source policy and licensing within that policy and others that come up.
Excellent. If you want to share your slide deck, I will get out of your way and get you started.
Perfect. Let me get set here. All right.
Oh, that's a nice start.
There you go.
Beautiful. There you go. All right, good. I'm going to back out and I'll see you in a bit.
All right, perfect. Thanks. So as I said, appreciate everyone joining today. We're looking forward to the sessions coming up, especially the customer success track, but all the great sessions we have lined up for today. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about our experiences with the customer deployments, as well as just trends that we see in open source usage. In my session, I'll focus on what organizations are doing to better manage, track, and monitor their open source consumption by utilizing automated tooling and changing their development culture. First, though, I'd like to discuss why this is an area of need for organizations to set the context on why they're starting to take these steps. And really the main driving factor of organizations taking these steps is the use of open source is exploding, right? So we see tens of billions of downloads per year from popular repositories in main ecosystems such as JavaScript, Java, and even in the container world, right? And we see over 1,000 new projects are created each and every day, right? And as a result, we see or know that up to 80 to 90% of a modern application actually contains or is assembled from these components, most of which are open source components, right? So the way that the application is being developed has changed mightily over the last several years, and this is instigating a change in our development processes and how we need to look at the problem area. And most of that comes from the fact that we know that these components aren't created equal, right? Some are healthier than others, some are older than others, some have metadata associated with them, such as vulnerabilities or licenses that could pose risk to the organization that we need to be aware of. And that may change over time, such as new security vulnerabilities that are present or becoming several versions back on a component, which could create technical debt within your application. And really, the usage has become so complex that it's impossible to manage it manually, right, with any efficiency or to any effectiveness, right? And this is really because, like I said before, the volume of downloads, tens of billions of downloads, organizations are consuming these, in the thousands per month across hundreds or thousands of applications. There's 14, on average, 14 new versions of these components coming out each year, right? There's a diversity of the projects. As we mentioned before, not all components are created equal. This doesn't even start to look at the transitive hull that comes into the application as well, right? So you download one component and that may pull in, tens or hundreds of other components because it relies on them to actually run. And those are the transitive dependencies that get pulled in. So being able to track those as well is also important and part of the total picture of what goes into the application, right? And the way we think about this is a supply chain problem, right? So imagine if a car manufacturer such as Toyota didn't know where they were sourcing their parts, didn't know the quality of those parts, and didn't know what cars those parts were going into with any level of consistency or accuracy, right? It would create probably hysteria from a lot of the world. But imagine if they had to do a recall, right? And this is, on the premise that they could actually determine that they needed to do a recall because they found out that one of the parts they were using was defective. They'd essentially have to ask everyone that owns a Toyota to come in because they potentially might have that part that potentially has the problem, right? And that obviously would not be a good way of doing business, and it's not the standard that we expect from areas such as car manufacturers, right? And if you think about the application space, that's kind of the space that we're in right now, in that we cannot always accurately identify the components that are contained within our applications, despite the risk associated with them, despite the quality aspects associated with them. So what we really want to do is be able to embrace these supply chain principles to bring that vision into an insight into what's in our applications, right? And that's really starts with sourcing high quality parts from trusted suppliers, and the ability to trace those parts wherever they're integrated in those applications so that you can quickly determine what the risk associated with those components may be, whether in development or in production. And what we see is that organizations who start to do this see tremendous gains in developer productivity, decrease in unplanned and unscheduled work, and reducing technical debt. And this is all while also reducing security and licensing risk, as well as maintaining any regulatory or compliance needed, and better component hygiene, right? And I think it's probably no secret for those attending this conference that to get started and where you need to begin to get a handle on your component consumption is first with a repository manager, right? So if we start to take a look at a simplistic view of an SDLC without a repository manager, as we build out this slide, we see that developers are pulling in open source components, third-party components straight from the internet. That gets committed to their source control, which then goes off to the build, which is usually automated through a CI tool such as Jenkins or Bamboo or TFS. And then that build, when it doesn't have all the transit dependencies that it needs, again, goes directly out to the internet every single time to grab those components that it needs on demand. And eventually you produce some artifact, some output of the build that goes into production, right? So in this case, these components are stored either in the source control, the build system, or on a file share somewhere, which is bringing a lot of inefficiencies into the process. So if we institute a repository manager, in that same view, we see the developers are actually reaching out to a repository manager like Nexus, OSS, or Pro, and that repository manager is proxying out to these public external repositories and then caching those components each time they're downloaded for reuse by that development project team or any other team within the organization. And then the same thing occurs, right? The fixes get committed to source control, that goes out to your build CI system, and now that grabs the components it needs from Nexus, and if Nexus doesn't have it, it will go out one time to grab those components and then cache them locally. So again, they're available for reuse, and again, ultimately you push something out into production, which can then be stored and released through the repository manager. And all of this results in many benefits, right? Whether it's decreased build times, reduced bandwidth, enforcing component naming conventions, or standardizing the release process, right? There's various benefits that come from instituting that repository manager from both an efficiency and development effectiveness standpoint. And so this starts to give us insight into component usage from a repository perspective. But as we mentioned before, ultimately those are ending up in the application to the tune of 80 or 90%. So we know that we need additional automated tooling that allows us insight and continuous monitoring of those components within the application context, again, where it's being built within the organization. And we know to be able to operate at the speed of DevOps and automate in that environment in a modern day application development lifecycle, there are certain requirements that that tooling must be able to do or have. And the first and foremost is the scans need to be fast, right? So you're scanning hundreds of thousands of applications and their transitive dependencies every day, right? It needs to be able to operate at the speed of your build so that it can scan synchronously and give you real-time feedback without any degradation to your build, or minimal degradation or build, rather than asynchronously after the fact, right? And depending on how long that may be, it may be too late for those results to have any impact on the current application development. When it does produce the results, they need to be very precise. It's not enough to be at the group and artifact level. You need to be down to the version level, which makes a world of difference when we're talking about differing versions that may or may not have, for example, a security vulnerability. Just as we said, not all components are created equal. We know not all applications are created equal, right? So we need some sort of guidelines based on the context of the application, such as whether it's distributed externally, it's a hosted service, or it's completely internal, or that it contains sensitive data or must maintain compliance, right? Some applications may have stricter policy constraints because of these than others. So we want to make sure that every result that is provided is a true positive in the context of that application. Then it's not enough to actually have the results. You need to know what to do with them, right? So you need some mechanism to report to the developers, to the end users, on what must be fixed and how to actually do it, and remediation guidance to do so. And then lastly, you do all this work to make sure that what goes out into production is approved and up to your standards. But once a application is out in production, you need a mechanism for continuously monitoring that production application, because the contents of it may now differ from what is now in development, right? Consider version 1.0 to 2.0, right? So it needs to be continuous, not only on what's in development, but what's out in production. So if we take a look at where we can start to institute an automated tooling like the IQ server within this process, we see that there are integration points that need to occur where the developers are actually sourcing the components, building those components. So the first thing that we're going to see is an integration point from the repository manager to developers, so that when they're sourcing components, there is a guidelines, a policy provided to inform them of whether or not this component will ultimately pass policy within their application. Second, within the IDE, so as they're continuously working, even before they get to the build, integrations into the IDE, so they have a view while writing any fixes or new features, and integrating those components, you can see in real time which components would pass that policy. Then another integration point at the build, as we mentioned before. So each and every time you build, you know exactly what's going into that application. Ultimately, once it goes out into production, you want a scan that happens before that. And then, as we said before, we need a way to continuously monitor that production application. We also know that a tool is not a process, right? And a process is not a tool. So the tool is not the sole answer. We also need a process that must be established around this to set expectations, train those developers, and track progress to continually make those improvements, right? So we need to start building a better bridge between these various groups that are involved, like development, security, operations, et cetera. And if we take a closer look at those folks that do get involved and the responsibilities they do have, we start out with the what we call policy participants. And these are subject matter experts from the various parts of the organization, whether that's architecture, security, legal, if there's an already existing open source group that helps us define what the guidelines should be, what are the criteria that developers should work by so that they know what is approved within the organization. We then have our integration participants that are going to help us actually integrate into that development lifecycle, from build engineers, but also development managers that control the developers' times, or at least guide the time and objectives for those developers. And then lastly, our participants that are going to interact with the tool itself, right? So generally we see a sponsor that is running that initiative, project owner that is a little bit more hands-on with the deployment, helping developers get integrated, and then lastly, the developers and users, right, who are going to see the results and have to act upon those results and ultimately live to the standards of what's in their application. So if we start to see where these people fit in the process, as I mentioned before, we have our developers, but we also need our policy team, which is going to help us create those guidelines. And when we have our project owner, that's going to help with things such as managing policy and exception handling within the IQ server, right? So all these groups start to come together and fill a role to help us embark and be successful on this process. Once we have those folks in place and we understand, you know, a general overview of what we want to accomplish, we see organizations go through a few different phases on their way to starting to build better insight into their applications and components contained within them, right? And we start off with discovery and inventory. And really, this is the process of understanding how your organization builds and releases software. Without knowing the inputs of where the developers are working, where components are going in, where they're coming out, we can't really understand or build that application inventory to be able to assess and initially and continuously monitor those components going forward, right? So once we have this information, it'll start to help us determine the number of applications in scope, how the applications get integrated, how you want to structure those applications within the tool, who does what, and the application types. As I said before, not all applications are created equal. We need to understand what type of data they contain, how they're externally distributed, and any other policy constraints that may apply to them that may not apply to others, so that we can have those contextual findings. You'll want to decide on how exactly you're going to approach the deployment with developers, right? So there are two main thoughts here. The first is a centralized approach, which is a smaller group of administrators that control most of the actions that occur within the process. And this gives you a lot of control and visibility over every single action that's occurring within the process. So there is a benefit there. However, it's not an effective way to scale across an organization, even, you know, of just 50 or 100 applications, much less, you know, 5,000 or 10,000 applications, which we see across large enterprises. And so what we really recommend is a federated approach where you start to federate out those responsibilities to the application teams. For example, giving some of those responsibilities to a dev lead or a dev manager to oversee and be responsible for their team's coding guidelines, right? So I like to think about it as another part of the definition of done, right? Did we pass policy after this sprint with any components that we introduced or any metadata that, components that changed, right? If not, we need to take a look at that, or else we're going to start to build up technical debt, right? And a dev lead or dev manager should be the appropriate party to be trusted with that process and also make sure that they can follow through on that. Once you've done that, you need to understand what are the actual guidelines for developers to follow, right? And this is where the subject matter experts come into play. And we refer to it as a policy, right? Your open source policy. And, you know, trying to simplify matters as much as we can, we really try to answer the question, what is the main purpose of policy first? And really the answer is to drive some sort of intended behavior, right? So if we look at real world examples of policies that are common to us, such as a no smoking sign, right? Smoking is not desired in that area. Speed limits, drive in and around this speed limit because the behavior is deemed to be safer, right? Something you probably tell your kids all the time, don't run with scissors, right? Why do you tell them this, right? You're trying to drive their behavior towards other actions that you deem more appropriate, safer, right? And then something as simple as password strength are all common examples of a policy in a real world context. So we take a look and translate that to, you know, policy in the IQ server. We believe it's a set of guidelines that's going to allow you to easily identify and reduce risk within your open source consumption. And we do so by defining traits and relative risk of bad components. So it's a blacklist. And then ultimately, what action is required once you have those results? Is this a must fix or not? And how do I go about doing it? Right. So at the end of the day, policy is your way of deciding what is and is not important pertaining to component consumption, either within your application team, within your business unit, or across your organization. And there's 4 main areas of policy that you want to be considering, and that is a few obvious ones such as security vulnerabilities that are associated with those components because they contain the potentially vulnerable code within the source code. License risk, which are licenses associated with open source components, and these licenses are made up of obligations, and obligations are requirements that the end user must adhere to in order to use those components. Some of these requirements are very liberal or less restrictive, and some of them are more restrictive and may cause you to have to do something you don't ultimately want to do. And so knowing what those licenses are and the obligations associated with them can become very important. There's also architecture, good component hygiene, right? So if you start taking a look at component age, you know, the older the component, it's been shown that the more vulnerable it tends to be. Popularity of that component. Are you on a version that is not widely used? Do you want to get to a more used version of that component? And other aspects such as like build cleanup, right? Is there any reason a test component should show up in a production application? This is something that we generally see when projects migrate from Ant to Maven and they don't get the scope set correctly, right? Best case scenario, it's just a component that you know, poor coding standards, right, within the application. Worst case scenario, there are some test components that have known to have security vulnerabilities. And then lastly, the match state, which is essentially the authenticity of the component. Is it the authoritative version, the original version, or has it been modified in some way, either by some third party or your development team along the way? And these can have obvious implications, whether from a security standpoint or a licensing standpoint. Once developers have those guidelines, they can start taking the next steps towards remediating or mitigating any risk that exists. And that boils down to a few key areas to keep in mind, and that is communicating proper expectations, making sure that findings are actionable, and then your overall organizational philosophy. So if we take a look at each one of these in a bit more detail, first and foremost, communicating expectations, right? You as a project team have the responsibility to ensure that the tooling is generating valid issues, right? Developers should focus on remediation rather than validation of the findings, right? And the lack of clarity of this can lead to frustration, bottlenecks in the process, or just a lack of trust in the tooling, right? So you really want to limit the mandatory issues that developers are going to receive so that it's actually actionable, right? So, you know, folks who are ever used any security or quality tooling, you know, in the past are probably familiar with this type of scene, right? Where every issue is critical. The problem is if everything's critical, nothing's critical. And at the very least, it's a sensory overload. You don't know essentially where to start. And there's just a lot of skepticism around the results, and there's a cost of doing business, right? We cannot focus on every single thing. So how do we take off bite-sized chunks to work towards overall better component hygiene, right? So we'd like to see something closer to this picture, right? Which is much more actionable, and the threat level actually denotes priority, right? So you can then give advice towards fixing the red, right? Whereas in the previous picture, everything was red. Now we've called out the most critical pieces of that risk that the organization wants you to focus on. And oh, by the way, you now have this other information in front of you should you want to take on that work within your development cycle, such as upgrading the version of component, right, to start decreasing the technical debt that the team has taken on over the years, right? So hopefully this information empowers developers to start making better choices while also maintaining that compliance that the organization is looking for. And then ultimately, we're all too familiar with the scan and scold, mentality, where there's a lack of transparency of the information that exists. When it comes to light, it's generally too late, and it ends up with a scolding mentality, right? And it's hard to make any progress in this state. What we like to promote is more of a support and guide method, right? Where all parties are on the same playing field of information. All right, so it promotes that transparency. Hopefully, as I said before, empowering developers to make better choices by giving you the information as early as possible in the life cycle, right? As we talked about, from sourcing the component to right in your IDE, so that you have all the information readily available. And then hopefully we're initiating constructive conversations rather than a scolding mandate at the end of the release cycle. And once you progress through the initial remediation and mitigation phase, you get into enforcement, right? This is the actual mandate that certain things must be fixed or else the application cannot be released, right? And a few key areas that we want to keep in mind here are the culture and maturity of the organization at the start of this process, right? So it's really an honest assessment of your current organizational maturity, but not necessarily with just open source consumption, but software development as a whole, right? So culture will help define early actions. So when we help out organizations, we're really trying to get that sense early on so we can understand the best steps to take given that organization's maturity. Some organizations are in a fail fast mentality, right? And they like failing the build for these types of issues, in which case we can integrate right into that process with help of the development team. But there's other organizations that do not have that type of culture. And so we do not want to start setting that precedent early on. We need to give developers time to react to those findings. And then ultimately we could reach a point where enforcement actions are integrated. But even with that, it may be wise to warn early and fail late. And what I mean by that is anything that you ultimately know cannot be released, right? It cannot get out the door. You set a warn, right? So it makes the build, quote unquote, unstable, right? In Jenkins terminology. And this is your way of informing developers. Anytime that happens, know that this will not get out the door. I'm not going to block your build. I'm not going to stop you from proceeding and making the change that I'm actually asking you to do, but this is your indicator, right? That this ultimately cannot go out into production. And so it's a kind of a hybrid approach to adding enforcement, but also doing it in a way that is, approachable with developers. And then lastly, even despite having what we refer to as a component governance workflow, we still want to promote component selection, right? So what we've talked about the last few minutes is more governance, right? This is what must be done in order to adhere to our organizational standards, this mandate to fix these issues, right? However, we still want to maintain some semblance of a component selection workflow where we're assisting developers in choosing better components. And this occurs when developers are empowered with this information to investigate the various choices that they have, again, as far left as sourcing that component and within their IDE.
Chris, just a heads up for a 3-minute warning.
Sure, thanks. So if we take a look at this, these phases again, just to kind of recap, remember discovery and inventory is really understanding how your organization builds and releases software so that we can start to get the inputs and understand where we need to integrate and start building that application and component inventory within the IQ server. We then have policy defined by our subject matter experts on top of that to help us understand what are the guardrails, the guidelines that we want to adhere to, but also empower us with the additional information on these components that wasn't previously available, prior to instituting automated tooling. We then get to the point where we actually want to do something with it and start getting value out of it, and that is mitigating any current risk or component hygiene or technical debt that does exist by taking action on those components. And then lastly, some semblance of enforcement on what must be done before it goes out into production. Of course, even with all of these, benefits and areas where organizations can make this a more successful process, we do still see where organizations are challenged, and you guys may have run into that as well. And first one is failure to embrace that change, right? So changing process is changing culture, and that's a difficult thing to do and takes a lot of effort and a lot of support within the organization. And then when you start to lose that support, or there's turnover, or there's new initiatives, or there's reprioritization of those initiatives, you start to lose momentum with that effort that you started. And then lastly, making sure that you have executive level support that has the ability to mandate that change and make sure to follow it through. Right. And within our successful customers, despite those challenges, we see that they have these main qualities, right? So having a strong executive sponsor that has the ability and the willpower to see that through, right? Setting expectations from the start, defining what success actually means. What is the primary desired outcome of what we're trying to achieve, and how are we going to actually measure that? So it's not just the value creation, but it's also value realization. And you may have heard yesterday, we just launched our SonoType community site, which is a place for not only organizations to interact with SonoType, but to interact with other organizations. So I'd encourage you to get involved there to help collaborate and communicate and start the discussions around where you guys are at in your organizational maturity, starting to build better component practices, and discussing with each other and leveraging your experiences with each other, as well as SonoType, to help start solving these problems and making progress towards building those better component practices. So I think I'm right on time here, Marc. I appreciate everyone's time today. Hopefully this was beneficial. I'll be in the Slack channel, for the next 15, 30 minutes. So feel free to ask any questions, and thanks again for your time.
Hold on there, Chris. You did a good. As I was making notes, I was trying to take notes, and there was just too much good stuff there. I'm going to have to scrub back and and listen. But there's a couple points I want to talk to.
Sure.
Yesterday, DJ Schleen from Aetna said exactly what you said about, go ahead and warn somebody early, but fail them late. Let the build move forward. With the team having knowledge that's, let me turn my camera on too so we can talk here. But I thought that's fascinating because we hear so much about break the build immediately. And then we heard yesterday from DJ on a huge one, let it move forward. What's the history on that? What do you got with that?
Yeah, so obviously by failing the build, it's a blocking action. But in reality, the first thing you need to do in order to fix the problem is to run the build, right? Build successfully. So if you think about it from a production application standpoint, if an application is in production and there is a new vulnerability that occurs and you need to fix that, the first thing you're going to try to do as a developer is to build it, right? And if the build is failing because of that exact thing that you're asking them to fix, it creates a prohibitive action for you to actually proceed, right? So the thing I like about the warn early is that it sets the expectations, but allows developers to proceed, right? Obviously, there needs to be some trust on multiple levels between the project sponsors as well as the dev leads and dev managers of what those expectations are, but it creates a more seamless option while still providing the organization the ability to have those controls in place prior to going out into production.
And then there were a couple slides in there I thought they were fascinating. One, let me just go back and look at my notes too here. The first one is when the 5 circles that you had, you might even pull that one back up with the discovery, the inventory, the policy. When you're looking at that, is that almost a mini maturity model that you can look at a company and say where they are within that phase and say how mature they are?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something that can be used on that case. Like I said before, the first thing you need to do is start with the repository manager, right? If you don't have a repository manager in place, when you get to these phases, it's going to be very difficult, even despite all the challenges, we mentioned above and beyond those. So once organizations have started to make the decision to go down this path, these are definitely the phases and maturities that we see throughout the organizations. And when you can reach that mitigation and enforcement phase, that's obviously starting to get towards, the holy grail there of instituting better component practices, driving down that legacy risk that exists, but hopefully pushing left in the process such that you're stopping the bleeding from the start, and in parallel, building better component practices while starting to reduce that existing risk within the organization.
The other big point that you talked on, and you had a really good quote there, and I didn't have time to write it down, but the essence of it was choosing what to remediate first. Remediate instead of something is what you said. I forgot what that was.
Remediate, was it around the component selection workflow?
I think so. It's like I said, I was scribbling so fast, but the gist of it was, first of all, you can't just put everything on somebody's desk.
Oh, right.
You gotta do it.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yep. Yeah. So I think it was around what's actionable, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
when every issue is critical, right, or if there are multiple false positives within the findings, it's very difficult for developers to actually act on the data, right? So we put the responsibility on ensuring that the findings are actionable on the project sponsors, on those project owners, such that developers focus on remediation, not validation of those findings, right? And even still, it's very easy for organizations to end up with a finding set result that looks much like this, where you don't even know where to start and there really is no direction on what needs to be fixed or what is actually critical. And we want to get more towards this picture, which allows the threat level to actually denote that priority and drive the developer actions. But hopefully this other information is still beneficial once it's integrated, within the IDE, and you have that at the tips of your fingers, which otherwise you may not have prior to the tooling.
So who is choosing what is actionable here? Is that part of an automated process, or is this a decision that has to be made?
That's a very good question. So, harking back to the beginning where I talked about the requirements of actually integrating this tooling within your environment, you need it to have certain qualities, right? It needs to be fast so that it actually operates at the speed of DevOps, at the speed of your builds and agile development. But the only way that it can also work is if you have proper guidelines built into a policy that can quickly, precisely, and contextually inform those developers so that all findings are true positives of what they actually need to act on. And those guidelines are built by the subject matter experts from security, legal, and architecture in terms of a threat level of what is the most severe down to what is beneficial to actually fix, but is not actually critical or mandated, right? And that policy is absolutely essential. Without it, you don't have those guidelines, and that's what bridges the gap between the subject matter experts and those stakeholders and developer expectations. I think you're on mute, Marc.
Yeah, I'm talking to myself.
Yeah,
That's the way my kids usually hear me too. It's a selective hearing. But I think even though I deal with you guys every day, when I hear a talk like this and you give the complete picture, it's fascinating because there is a process for getting this to be done. Very happy to have your session here. Just Melanie and Jerry are going to come on in about 10 minutes. We're on a break. But you want to give a brief overview of what they're working on?
Yeah, so they decided to tackle a very interesting topic, which is open source licensing. So I touched on it briefly earlier. I didn't want to steal too much of their thunder, but one of the criteria of being an open source component is that you have an open source license, right? And so these licenses are going to dictate the terms of service of use, essentially, for that open source component. And some of them have obligations that are very restrictive, and some of them have obligations that are very nebulous, right? It's hard to make anything of them. Developers aren't lawyers. We don't want them to be lawyers. We don't want them to spend time on investigating licenses, right? So we create policy from the subject matter expert in the legal space that allows to define those guidelines so that they can quickly see, does this component have a restrictive license? Let me get on a component that does not, right? So it's a very interesting topic. There's a lot there. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Melanie and Jerry, I see you jumped in. I'll see you back here in about 7 minutes and we'll get started. Chris, thanks. If you would go to the Slack channel, upload the deck, your deck to the Slack channel,
Perfect.
and we'll talk to you later. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Great. Jerry and Melanie, thanks for jumping in. I'm going to just step away for a second to get things set up for the next track, and I'll be right back.
All right. Thanks a lot. Hey, Melanie, I just want to check audio. Are you there?
Jerry, you're sounding good. I got you.
Thank you.
Melanie, I'm gonna mute you there, Melanie.
I hope you can hear me now.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everybody for showing up. We're about 3 minutes away from kicking off the next session. Get yourself a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, something to keep you going for the day. And then we're going to bring Jerry and Melanie in. Back to you in about 3 minutes. All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Jerry and Melanie, how are you?
Hey, doing good. How are you
Doing
today?
great here.
I'm doing good. You got your Kent State t-shirt on. You're doing good.
Oh, yeah. Got to give a shout out to my alma mater.
Melanie, where are you today physically? Where are you?
I live in Ann Arbor, so I'm in my home office.
Ah, that's nice. The campus there. I mean, that's everybody knows the campus, right?
Right.
All right. So, Jerry, give us like the 30-second overview. What are you guys going to cover today?
Yeah, so we're going to cover basically open source software licensing and how we can help basically manage that, right? So there's a lot of different types of software licenses that are included with open source, and just share a lot of experiences as we talk with our customers and just how they deal with it.
Excellent. I'm going to become invisible. I'm going to turn it over to you guys and have fun.
Yep. If you want to lock it in on me, I'm going to go ahead and share my slide deck. And give me 2 seconds here to share. And then Melanie, do you see that okay?
Yes, I do.
All right. So, hey, thanks for joining us here today. Are you operating without a license? That could be dangerous. So, quick introductions. My name is Jerry Gergel. I'm a customer success engineer. I'm on the customer success team at SonoType. I'm one of the lucky ones that actually get to go out and visit and work with customers directly. So, there's been some conversations I've been involved with, and Melanie and I collected some information around open source software licensing, and just want to share with everyone, as I said earlier, just the conversations we get into and a little bit of how we can help. So that's who I am. Melanie?
Sure, I'm Melanie Latin with SonoType. I work on the customer education team. And Jerry and I put together the slide deck and also an infographic. So we have a nice little set of materials for you after this session. We'll show you how to go ahead and get to that material.
Okay, so with that, let me go ahead and just kind of kick it off here. Quick disclaimer, we're not lawyers. We don't claim to be lawyers. We're not giving any kind of legal advice. The whole intent of this session was to just kind of raise awareness that what's involved with open source licensing, give you some references, which Melanie talked about at the end. We'll talk about the references and the material we have for you. But at the end of the session, if you can answer these 4 questions basically for yourself, that we've achieved our goal. So we want to make sure you understand in general what open source software licensing is, and more importantly, why do you care? And how to get started in terms of looking at the licenses that may already be, right? You may already have a whole inventory of licenses in your applications that are already built and being used. Just share a little bit of the woes that we've heard in the industry. Basically the people that in general, from my opinion, just who were unaware and what to look out for. And then at the end, we'll save some time to take a look at Nexus Lifecycle. I want to plug some of the other sessions. I'm going to take a very top level view just to give you an idea of, you may not know what Nexus Lifecycle can do with the policy evaluation and the application evaluation. So I want to share that, but the other sessions later today are going to get into some more practical use cases, and I think even some remediation. So if you like anything that you've seen here today, take a look at some of the other sessions. They're going to get much more detail around Nexus Lifecycle. So, what is open source what is open source licensing? You know, normally when you think about trademarks or copyrights or anything like that, you're thinking about things that protect a company or things that protect a person. In the case of open source licensing, it's really about protecting the software. About the intent is to make sure that the software can remain open source, can be used and shared openly, right? So the whole intent around the licensing is to keep and preserve that. And not all the licenses are the same, but we'll see. And I just want to point out and give you some awareness is that some of the licenses go a little bit further and they put more requirements on it. But just remember, the intent of really all of open source software licensing is to make sure that that software can remain open sourced and freely used. So why do you care? Again, some of the licensing, and we'll go through an example or two, put added requirements that state, in general, in layman's terms, if you use this open source software and if you distribute it, and we'll talk about what that means a little bit to give you an idea, but if you use this open source software, you have to make available, public available, the software that you've distributed. So you have to think about the company you're working for, any patents, any trade secrets, your software itself may be your competitive advantage, right? So it's really important to take a look at what is included with that open source software that's maybe already in the applications that you're using, and just sit down with your company to make sure that you're not putting anything at risk, right? So that's why you care. It's not that there's anything malicious going on with this open source software licensing. It's just some of those licenses your organization may deem a little too risky, and you have to know where those are, where they're being used, and just make sure you're protecting yourselves. So copyright and copyleft, tomato or tomato. So copyleft is a real thing. We'll talk about that. It's a bit of play on words. I have to take a step back. When I first started looking at open source software licensing, again, I talked about the fact that I'm lucky. I get to go work with customers, and a lot of questions do come up around this. I started to realize that it sounds simple, but it can be a little tricky. And the simplest thing for me, I looked at all of it and realized there's really 2 buckets that we really care about. There's couple different categories, but the 2 that I really cared about and my customers care about are the permissive or liberal type licenses, and then the copyleft licenses. So these are 2 categories that you just want to make yourself familiar with and understand what they are. The permissive or liberal licenses, basically the license says, hey, you can do whatever you want with the software. You can modify it, you can use it. You're going to use it at your own risk, right? There's no warranty or anything. And pretty much in many of these licenses, they just want you to acknowledge the software, the original person who or group that produced that software, and just give them proper acknowledgement. Now, Copyleft actually adds requirements, and there's, again, different types of Copyleft licenses. There's two things, though, that are common, or two things that come up, which are distribution, which we'll talk about in a minute. And if you distribute your software, there are some added requirements, such as you have to make your software publicly available, or any changes that you've made to that open source software, you have to publish or make publicly available. And then sometimes there's notion of derivatives, meaning anything that was derived from the use of that open source software has to be kept under the same terms of the Copyleft license. So these are things that are added to the licenses that, when I talked about, hey, do you have anything in your software that would be deemed competitive advantages or anything that you wouldn't want the public to know, you need to know what types of licenses are included with that open source, just so that you're not putting your company or your organization at risk. Before I move on, there's actually a beerware license that's out there. It's kind of funny if you look, and I've given the references just out of interest if nobody's heard of this, but basically the beerware license is a type of license that says, hey, if you like my software and you use it and you ever meet me in a restaurant or a bar, you have to buy me a beer. So not all of these licenses are going to put necessarily the company at risk, but these two categories you definitely want to pay attention to. So a couple examples, and I'll peel off the onion on one of them, but some permissive or liberal licenses, the BSD, the Berkeley Software Distribution, the MIT, the Apache 2. These are things you're going to see all the time. These are very common. And again, these are the ones that in general, generally speaking, they just say, you can use these however you like, but you have to acknowledge us, right? You have to include these licenses with the software if you distribute it. It's an important note to also make that a lot of times people worry about, hey, if I'm just using the software internally, how does the licenses really affect us? You need to talk to your legal team, obviously, but in most cases, companies are viewed as a legal entity, right? As a person, as a legal entity. So you can use it freely internally. It really starts to get interesting when you distribute or start to sell software with open source in it. Again, it's your legal team that needs to make that determination, but permissive or liberal licenses pretty much say, hey, you can use this however you want, but give us acknowledgement. The Copyleft licenses, the Feral GPL, for example, or just GPL in general, lesser GPL, these are all types of licenses that are fairly common. You'll see them out there, and they're the ones that add additional requirements. So let's just kind of peel the onion off of the AGPL one. So again, there are some references we have with the slides that we're going to share and the infographic that Melanie put together. There's some really good reference material out there. You can hit some public links and read about licenses and how they're described. I used many of those myself to put this together. But if you peel off the onion of this one, for example, it says, hey, you know what? It allows you to use it for commercial use. That's great. That's perfect. Not all of them do. But many of them just say, hey, you can use it, you can modify it, you can distribute it. And then, of course, what's not allowed in the license is to hold liable, right? There's no warranty. If there's a bug or something that software does that hurts your data, you can't hold the people who publish the software liable. Now, active projects, as we all know, out in the open source community, they do a really good job of trying to fix their bugs, of trying to get things out there for you to use, that the newer versions, but you got to really know that you're not going to be able to go back in time to a project that's not even active anymore. You need to be aware of these things. Now, in this case of the AGPL one, it adds requirements, and this is kind of interesting. If you distribute the software that you've written that includes this open source software, right? It's included or embedded in your application. It says if you distribute it, meaning you've given it to a customer, you have to make your software publicly available. What's also interesting about this one is there's a notion of making it available as a service. Again, you need to sit down with your legal team to understand what these licenses are really saying and how they apply to you. You just need to be aware that distribution can mean different things, and you need to take an assessment or an inventory of what's out there. So now that we know there's different types of licenses, and some of them are pretty liberal and some of them add restrictions, there's 4 questions or 4 things that commonly come up and get discussed. So what is distribution? Again, does that mean you've written some software, included some open source in it, and sent that to a customer? That probably means distribution. Is it internally used? That probably isn't distribution. Um, do I have it available as a service? Again, depending on the license, that may mean it's been distributed. So you need to sit down with your organization, understand what licenses are in the open source, and then make a determination of what distribution actually means. Um, where is this software, or how is this open source software used? You want to make sure that you're protecting yourself, so anything that you've patented or anything you consider a competitive advantage in the software you've written isn't impacted or isn't at risk. And then giving notice. We talked about the fact that some of these licenses just say, hey, give proper notice, give proper rights, let people know you've included our software, include our license that is with our software that you're using. So you need to sit down and understand, what does it really mean to comply with the notice? Sometimes it's just include the license, sometimes it's a little bit more. And then derivative work. You're taking probably 80% of your applications could be made up with open source, and then there's a little bit that you've added on to it. So is that derivative work? Is that called out in the licensing? So it's kind of interesting. I'm going to pause for a second. As I mentioned, I get to work with our customers, and sometimes it's a situation where the development organization or the engineering organization gets to sit down with me and my other colleagues, but they also get to sit down with legal, and that doesn't always get to happen. So these conversations can get kind of interesting. But if you can answer these 4 questions with your colleagues at work, with your legal representation, you're probably well down the path of making sure that you're managing your risk appropriately. So a couple of cases that are out there, I'm just kind of throwing some names. We've provided some public articles that you can read about these companies. The one I want to talk about for a minute is Linksys. If I can say it's infamous, I don't know if I can say that, but it's pretty well known. But if you haven't heard about this before, it was interesting. Linksys obviously is a manufacturer, or was a manufacturer of routers. They were acquired by Cisco some time ago. In one of their routers, in the source for one of their routers, they included the Linux kernel and some GPL open source software. It became known that that software and kernel was in there, and obviously they're distributing their software when they're selling it, and ended up in a lawsuit. Cisco had no idea this was going on. At least the story was written that way, or most people are under the impression that Cisco didn't know when Linksys got acquired. At the end of the lawsuit, what they had to do is make the software, the router software source itself, publicly available. Now, that may not have hurt Cisco really all that much, but if you think about it, they had to make the entire software that was in that router publicly available. These are real situations. You have to know what licenses are included, and your organization may flat out just ban certain types of licenses, even if you're using it internally. It's good to know, and that's what we want to do today, is just raise awareness, get that inventory, and just have those conversations with your teams about, do we want to keep this open source software, or possibly shift to something that doesn't have such a risky license associated to it. So how can we help you, and things that we get involved with? I'm going to share a little bit about Nexus Lifecycle. But again, I want to just remind folks, there are other sessions. They're going to go into more practical use cases, probably even get into some remediation or some techniques that they've found themselves working with customers with. So take a look at some of these sessions. And again, if any of this is interesting or you find it valuable, there's going to be other sessions that get much farther into the Nexus Lifecycle software itself. And my biggest advice I can give you is get with your legal team. They're there to help you. They're there not to hinder you. We all just want to make sure that the company and your companies are knowledgeable and have the information they need to make the right decisions. So we'll go through a little bit about how we can help you know the licenses that are in your software. We have this notion of what's declared and what's observed. I'll kind of explain that a little bit. And then we'll talk a little bit about policies and how you can help guide your development teams. So I'm going to start with the ending. This is a policy evaluation view. It basically highlights anything that you've deemed risky. What I find really interesting and really exciting is that the same tool that you keep hearing about showing you the vulnerabilities in the open source software that you're using, it's the same tool that's going to catalog all of the licenses that you're using. So it's really simple to be having those conversations about what's risky and having it in conjunction with the vulnerabilities. It's really not hard to talk to your management team to say, look, there's this new vulnerability. It's in this piece of software. We've deemed it critical, but we also have this license that we need to address and be able to present that back to leadership and just say, look, this is worth our time. We need to do some remediation. We're gonna really reduce risk for our organization. So it can be policy driven. And again, the big thing here is it's the same technology that's highlighting any security issues or security vulnerabilities you might have. So what does it look like? It's actually pretty simple. This is an application view, a sample application. There's a tab here that's going to take a look at the license analysis. I'll talk a little bit about how you can set up a policy, but essentially it's highlighting the most risky licenses that it's found inside that as an evaluation, and then lets you know what component it is, and you can actually dive into some more detail here. But it's very simple to use. It's just a result of the evaluation. This is a component view. This component view actually gets into a lot of information, but let me just kind of focus you on a couple things here. Which if you haven't seen this before, it's actually giving you the history of that component, this log back component that I picked as an example. It tells you what version you're actually using. It tells you what license risk there is. Is it something that you've deemed as a banned license? Is it something that's risky? Maybe it's very liberal and you're free to use it. And it also lines it up with the security risks. It'll go through and tell you what's been declared. So the declared is okay. So there's a license that comes with the software. This is the license type that's been declared. But SonoType also does research. So what's really interesting is you get into conversations with your development teams about open source software that you've used, but that open source software might actually be using other open source software. So embedded inside of it might actually be another open source software project which has maybe a different license that was actually been declared by the software you've actually pulled down, right? So what can get into an interesting conversation is well, which one is actually effective? Which one do we actually recognize? What's great is that we're pulling all that out and we're making that obvious for the conversation here, and then you can have those discussions, right? And then what's also interesting is the licensing can change over time, just like the vulnerabilities. The open source project or the originator of software may change their license, and so you can actually scroll through the information here. The research that we've done is presented to you, and you actually might be able to pick a version of that software with a license that's a little less risky. So the policies, this actually makes it really simple. So we provide some getting started templates out of the box. This is showing the banned licenses, and you have the ability to sit down with your legal team, with your leadership team, and just say, which ones of these license categories are we going to say are liberal? Which ones do we actually view as liberal? Which ones do we view as risky or banned? So we do provide a lot of suggestions out of the box, but you can go through and customize this to your liking. Now, what's going to happen is these policies are going to have different threat levels associated to them. So if everything inside that application is very liberal, or you consider it very, very weak or very low risk, it's going to come back with a good evaluation. if all of a sudden somebody did some development and they added some open source software that had a very risky license associated to it, you can have notifications go off, or you can even break the build if you wanted to let everyone know this is a license that needs to be reviewed. Maybe it's not something we want to put into our software. So again, it's the same technology that's looking at all the vulnerabilities and giving you your threat levels. Your licensing now could be included in that evaluation so that you can have a full conversation around the total threat to your organization. I'm not going to get into this really deep, but Lifecycle has the ability to notify you at different points in your process. So if you look at this from a factory approach, what's going on in development? Are they pulling down software that may have a banned license or we view as a very risky license? Do you want to notify the developer? Again, that whole concept you've been hearing for the last day and a half about shifting left. It would be probably a lot better to tell your research and development team and your development teams early on that that's a license that's really risky, and have that conversation up front rather than going through the entire development life cycle, going through all your testing and releasing it and realizing that's really not a license that we really want to accept. So the earlier you can provide information, obviously, is better. But again, in the case of a banned license where the company just doesn't want to take the risk, you can set that to something that might fail the build when you're doing staging, maybe fail the build before release, not even let that into production. So these things are all configurable, just like the vulnerability and the security policies. You can set these things up to help give those guidelines to your development organization, and maybe even prevent a license from getting out there that you really don't want. So in summary, I really appreciate the last 20 minutes or so that we've been talking. I'm going to turn this over to Melanie for a minute or two. We've put some information together for you, and I'll let Melanie talk about that.
Thanks, Jerry. That was really great. So to summarize what we were talking about today, as Jerry said, hopefully now you have a better understanding of what an OSS license is and why you should care about it. Also, we want you to be able to know where to get started using open source software. So if you're just getting into this, we're going to provide you with lots of references and lots of really great information. Jerry told you one story of Cisco who didn't care or wasn't aware of the issue with the license. We also listed a few other stories there, and we have links to those in the material that we're going to provide to you. And then also additional details on how Sonatype's Nexus Lifecycle can help you. So I'd like to invite you to join the discussion at community.sonotype.com, where we can continue this discussion. You can also download the presentation that you've seen here and the infographic that we talked about as well. Or you could send me an email to education@sonotype.com, and I'll send you a link right back to get to this information, the presentation, and the infographic. If you have any questions at all, go into that community and post them there, and we will be happy to respond to you. Thank you so much for your attention today.
Yep, I really appreciate everyone's time. And Marc, that's pretty much the conclusion. I don't know if you had any questions or how you wanted to end it, but we are pretty much done. All right, well, with that, I appreciate everyone's time. Jump into HIP chat. If you have any questions, Melanie and I will jump over there. Again, just shoot us an email, and looking forward to meeting all of you maybe one day on a session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys very much. Let's see. Jerry's already bailed over the track. Melanie, you still here?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right. Well, thank you guys. It was it's interesting as far as what you guys are working on. When you're looking at this, Melanie, what's one of the most critical things that Jerry just went over? When you're looking at the whole overall scheme, what's the most critical thing people can be looking at?
Well, I would say probably the not knowing what you don't know. So if you don't know it, how are you going to ask the questions? So the questions that Jerry presented in that, the 4 questions, that if you can answer those questions, you're pretty well on your way. I think that's really critical. And then the material, like I said, that we packaged to go with this can help you get those questions answered and get you well on your path to working well with OSS.
One of the things I'm also talking to people about too is how do you gauge the maturity of an organization based upon what you guys are seeing? Have you got something on that?
I don't have that handy, but I wish Jerry wouldn't have jumped off because I think that was one of the things he was looking at.
Oh, good. I think that's critical too, because I think people that are watching you and thinking about, okay, where do I fit in that process that we're talking about? So that'd be cool. Okay, thank you.
Very
Head
good.
for the Slack room.
Will do.
See you
Thanks.
soon. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Fernando, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Oh, doing good. Thanks. Where are you physically?
I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio.
Oh, the heart of the nation. It's the Cavs aren't doing too good, are they? You guys are pulling for the Cavs, aren't you?
Yeah, I guess. Cincinnati is kind of a city-state, right? We're in the tri-state area within Indiana and Kentucky, so there's allegiances to the various college teams and some pro teams.
Yeah. All right, cool. What you going to cover today?
My presentation is called 5 Steps to Success. So I'm going to share with the audience some of the best practices that we have seen with customers and how they've been successful with the Nexus platform. So just going to cover those steps and hopefully we'll have some questions and we'll have a nice interactive session.
All right, cool. Let's see, we're about 4 minutes away from, well, 3 minutes away from people wanting to start up. Anything you want to do as an overview to get people ready for what you're going to talk about?
No, I think we'll cover that during the presentation. It should be pretty self-explanatory. So if anybody needs to grab a quick drink, I guess we have a couple minutes.
That's great. Well, if you're in Europe, you can grab a quick drink. If you're in the States, get yourself a cup of coffee or tea. We actually have had presentations where people were eating spaghetti and drinking wine during the presentation. Now that's relaxed.
Yeah, I just have a little bit of water.
I'll see you back here in 2 minutes, okay?
Oh, okay, I'll be here.
For those of you on hold here, we're with Fernando and we're going to start up in less than 1 minute. So get yourself set up. We'll be ready to go. Fernando, I meant to say thank you yesterday. And for those of you that missed it, the Delta presentation yesterday was great. Did you get a chance to see them do it?
Yes, I had to actually rewind on YouTube. I had a customer call right at the same time, but thankfully in YouTube you can rewind the presentation, so I was able to watch it. Not live, but 30-minute delay. But yeah, it was great. I'm so happy for them.
What a remarkable story, huh?
Yes. It's been great. It's been a pleasure helping them.
All right. So for the people that just stepped in, why don't you introduce yourself and tell them what you're going to talk about, and I'll disappear and be back in a half hour.
Sounds great. Hello, everybody. My name is Fernando Cremer. I'm a customer success engineer with SonaType. And today my presentation is called 5 Steps to Success. So what I'm going to talk about is how to, based on some of the best practices that I've seen customers, not only at Sonatype, but other software companies, what they have done to have successful deployment. So let's start by sharing my screen, and then we'll go through my slides deck here. Okay, so you should see my slides, and
they just disappeared. We had them for a second.
Okay, let me try that again. How's that?
There we go. We're good.
Great. So as I mentioned, the name of my presentation is called 5 Steps to Success. And what I'm going to share with you today is best practices that I've seen, 5 best practices that I've seen customers at SonoType and other software companies put in place that have led to successful deployments of their software. So I'd like to start by first a quick introduction. I joined SonoType as a customer success engineer last July, so coming very close to my first year anniversary. Prior to being in customer success, I spent 10 years in pre-sales. So I was the guy that would come to your meeting and do a demo of a software or help you with a POC. And I did this for various software companies, as you can see. And prior to that, I spent quite a bit of time in technical support and also spent a little bit of time in QA and consulting. Fun fact, I was born in Lima, Peru, and lived there until I was 12. And I used to do TV commercials as a kid when I lived there. So that's my fun fact for today. So the main question that we like to answer today throughout my presentation is, what makes a customer successful? Is it that they install their software? Is it that they have it installed and they have it configured? Is it that they have people using it, right? What's really the criteria to consider somebody to be successful? And in order to answer that question, the first thing that we have to look is step number 1. And step number 1 is define your primary desired outcome. So what do we mean by a primary desired outcome? And when you think about a primary desired outcome, you have to think about it from a strategic kind of point of view. So here I have a picture of one of my favorite games of all time. So for any of you that don't know what this is a picture of some people playing the game of Risk. So the point of this game is this global domination, right? And in order to achieve that goal, you have to have small moves, right? You have to have little tactical moves. For example, you have to conquer a country, or you have to conquer a whole continent, so you have reinforcements your next turn. Those are little small tactical moves in order to achieve that overall goal, which is to own the entire board, global domination. And I think that's very similar when it comes to software. You have a strategic goal in mind that you need to achieve with the software. And in order to achieve that goal, you must have small tactical moves to help you get there. For example, install the software, configure it, have a training session, onboard teams. All those are small steps that lead you to that strategic goal. So when you think about what's a strategic goal when it comes to SonoType products, whether it's Nexus Repository, Nexus Lifecycle, and Nexus Firewall, you may be looking to maybe reduce the risk to the organization by reducing exposure via open source licensing, what Jerry was previously talking in the previous session, or exposure to threats by having vulnerable components in your applications. You may be looking to improve build reliability or increase build velocity with the Nexus repository. So the first thing that you have to do is always define that primary desired outcome. And what we find with talking with customers is that sometimes gets lost. Sometimes the folks that buy the product and know about that primary desired outcome hand it to somebody to install it in deployment, and they don't know what that primary desired outcome is. So it's always good to have that guiding North Star in mind when you are deploying the product and installing it, and kind of remember what the end goal in mind is. So that is the very first step. Let's go with step number 2. And step number 2 is to define success. So what does success to you mean for your organization? In this picture, I have some people climbing up a mountain, right? And that's another analogy for a desired outcome. Your primary desired outcome is to reach that mountaintop. but you're going to have steps along the way to get you to that mountaintop. And it's important to define what those success steps are going to be. You're not going to boil the ocean. So we do recommend that you break it up into consumable little steps that are achievable within a real time frame, and that is something that the team is able to achieve and be successful at. So it's very important that you define, what does success look like for your organization? Is it a specific metric? For example, you might say, if you're using Nexus Lifecycle, you might say, we want to reduce CVE 10 components by 50% in the first month. Or maybe we want to make sure there are no Copyleft license in any distributed applications within the next quarter. So it's important to start to set up small steps and small success points along your journey, so you're able to see the progress. It's always important that you can communicate progress to your leadership. When you spend budget on a product and you have to later explain why you did that, what progress have you made, it's always good to have those points, those milestones that you can point to and show that you are making progress and you're having success along the way. Step 3 is to continuously measure. You have to always measure in order to know how to improve. So it's important that as you measure, as you go along those steps that I mentioned along your journey, it's important that you measure. So that way you can compare measurements along the way and be able to see how you have improved. So for example, when we deploy Nexus Lifecycle and we have our sessions with customers and give them best practices on how to roll out Lifecycle, we tell them that the first step is for you to scan an application. Before you talk about rolling the IDE integration, or you talk about starting to fail or warn the build, even before any of those conversations take place, the first step you have to do is do that initial scan of your application. The reason we recommend that is because that allows you to have a baseline of what things look like today. So that gives you a nice starting point of what's the problem, what's the scope of the situation that you have today. And then as you move forward and you start to implement those various steps, you can start to measure at each of those steps and compare it back to the previous milestone. So that way you're able to see and track the improvement as you go along the way. This will help you ensure that you're making progress. And again, it allows you to show that you're being successful along the way. That gives us to step number 4. So as you reach all those various steps and all those success steps, it's important that you celebrate the successes. As I've worked with customers at SonoType and other companies, I find it that celebrating each success, no matter how small it is, no matter how small the step, is very important. It helps you with morale within the team. It makes you make sure that, hey, we're doing something good here. We're making progress. We're making a difference. And that helps you kind of recharge your batteries for the next cycle or for the next phase in your implementation. So as you go through each phase in your implementation and you reach success, it's important to celebrate it and recognize the work that your team has done. And you know what, socialize it in the company as well. Hey, you know, we have reduced the exposure to the company by 25% because of the work we have done. So it's very important that you celebrate those successes, you socialize those successes. And, you know, you don't have to throw a big party or nothing, but, you know, here in this picture, they're having a little pizza party and celebrating their success. So I think I don't see that enough with customers. And I think it's very important because, as I mentioned, it will help you with morale and ensure that the team stay focused and their batteries are recharged, as I mentioned, for the next phase and keep moving along. And this brings me to step number 5. And step number 5, it talks about engaging internally and externally. So what do I mean with this? Well, if we start with first with engaging internally, it's very important that you engage every stakeholder, regardless of what the tool is. So for example, if you're implementing one of our products, you're going to have engagement and involvement from development. Even if it's Nexus Repository Manager, they're going to be using Nexus Repository Manager to proxy and download open source components. So you definitely want their buy-in. You definitely want their involvement. You don't want to hand people down or tell people down what they need to do, what they need to use, but rather involve them and make them part of the decision. You're going to have to integrate with other tools. So you're going to have to involve folks that maybe manage the build systems or other systems that you are going to integrate with. So it's very important that you involve those as well. You also want to involve any executives or any leadership that is going to help you sponsor this involvement. Sometimes you may have to get involved with infrastructure, maybe folks that are working at different team or they report to a different director within your company. So by having executive sponsorship, you ensure that if you are not getting the proper access to the proper resources, those folks can facilitate those and allow you to move along with your deployment. So it's very important that early on you involve the right folks. When we do our policy workshops, we like to involve folks from security, from legal, from development, and these are teams that normally don't talk to each other. And that's a great time to get everybody involved. And we find that many times we have to rely on executive sponsorship to ensure that the right people are made available for those type of policy workshops. So cannot stress it enough, involve internally the right people early in order for your deployments to be successful. And then socialize those deployments and socialize what the plan is. So everybody is in the loop, everybody knows what's coming, and that will make your deployment much more successful. I also talked about involving or getting engaged externally. So by that, I mean get involved with user communities, whether it's SonoType sponsored communities or user-focused communities. It's very important to know what your other peers are doing. It's very important to be able to talk to them and learn what works for them. What works for them may work for you. Sometimes it may be helpful to talk to peers within your own industry that have to have the same regulations, have to meet the same type of requirements based on the industry, and might have the same challenges. So being able to talk to your peers is very important, and you can learn a lot from them. So I encourage you to sign up for any type of local user groups that may be in your area, any type of conferences like ours, because you will learn a lot from your peers. From a Sonatype perspective, I will encourage you to go to mysonatype.com. So that's a central location. It's a customer portal where you can go to access our brand new community, which we just launched, to talk with your peers. We are very active in there. So if you have any questions, best practices, that's somewhere where you can ask your questions and we'll be there to help you answer. You can access our documentation. So if you have more questions on more functional, how to install this, how to configure, we want to start using Nexus repository for Docker, for example. How do we set up a Docker proxy? All those type of details are included in our documentation. So definitely go there for any of your more technical questions. We recently we recently launched our learning channel. So we are starting to produce online, free, self-paced learning that our customer education team is putting out. I encourage you to check those out. We're starting with Nexus repository basics, but we're going to build on and add more courses as time goes on. So if you have a new administrator joining the team for Nexus Repository Manager, those are great courses to get them up to speed. And like I mentioned, we'll keep adding more videos and more training courses as time goes on. And lastly, but not least, you can also access our support. You heard yesterday from the Delta presentation how much they relied on support and how helpful the folks at support are. Everyone at support, not just Rich, but everybody in support is very helpful. I see it every day. I check this tickets for all my customers, and I see how they're always helping customers, and they go way above what they're really required to do. You also joined All Day DevOps. So this is a practitioner conference that our company puts up. It's not a Nexus conference. It's a practitioner conference. It's 24 hours of DevOps presentations from practitioners. We've had very successful all-day DevOps already, 2 of them, I believe, and there's one coming up for this year. So it's like this same conference. It's free, and it's recorded. So if you are not able to join all the sessions, it's something that you can go back and learn. But of course, as I mentioned, not only attend our stuff, also attend other conferences that are within your that are local to you. So for example, DevOps Days is one that I like to get involved. DevOps Days Ohio, since I'm in Cincinnati. That's a great time to interact with other practitioners, learn what's trending in the industry, and also learn what's going on in the world of DevOps and DevSecOps. And of course, I would also recommend that you get involved with customer success. So throughout this presentation and this user conference, I've been very impressed with how little we've done of selling to you about SonoType products. So this may be the one time where I do a little bit of selling, but it's just for you to be aware of what is available from SonoType customer success. So just to let you know, in case you're needing any help with your deployments, know that we can come on site and do a repository manager hands-on training. So if you are new to Nexus repository, recently had a customer that they took over Nexus repository, and for them was this, this box, and they didn't know what was in there and what was capable of it doing. So we came on site and did a hands-on training to let them know what was available and what they could do with Nexus repository. For Nexus Lifecycle, we have a fundamentals workshop. So if you kind of want to know what we can help you with, just to get started with the very basis of Nexus Lifecycle, that's available. We've talked about the Nexus Lifecycle Policy Workshop. So this is probably one of our most popular offerings. This is when we come on site and sit in a room with you, your legal team, your security team, and we look at your policies and put them in the product. So when we walk out of the room that day, you have your policy set up and ready to start scanning your applications. This is probably one of the biggest kickstarts that you can have to have Nexus Lifecycle up and running. We also have a Nexus Lifecycle Champion Workshop. So this is where you can kind of, after you have your policies in place and you have done some scanning and you have now set up that baseline and you kind of have now an idea of what the scope of the problem is, we can come back and do a champion workshop. And this is when we start to talk about remediation. What are the best practices to rolling out? And also look at remediation strategies, whether it's vulnerabilities, whether it's license usage. We go over things like waivers or setting that this vulnerability is not applicable to this application. That's what we cover during the champion workshop. We also have a lifecycle developer training class. So now you have your policies set up, you know what you're going to do for remediation, but now it's time to roll it out. It's time to have your developers install the Eclipse plugin, for example, and they're going to start using that plugin to select better components. So this is a workshop, our training class, when we can come on site or do it remotely, and we can help your developers install the plugin, make sure they have it up and running, walk them through the various configurations and options and functionality in that plugin, and answer any question. And we'll work with you together to communicate and socialize what's the plan, right? Starting on this date, we're going to start to warn on your builds. Right. Next quarter, we're going to start to not allow you to deploy into certain environments if they have this type of vulnerabilities. So this is a great time to roll out and socialize to the rest of the teams what's the plan when it comes to Nexus Lifecycle. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention it again, it's very important to involve your developers. Ultimately, they are the ones that are going to do the remediation. They are the ones that will have to select a different component if that's the remediation. So ultimately, we want to have them engaged and involved and definitely have buy-in from them. We also offer installation quick starts. So whether it's Nexus repository or Nexus Lifecycle, if you need help, a little guidance from us to help guide your team to get it up and running and configured and ready to go, we also offer packages. And if you are a customer that's had the repository for a long time or Nexus Lifecycle and maybe you think it may need a tune-up, maybe it's not performing the way you think it should, we can also do a health check for you, kind of check how you have it configured, what's kind of the hardware that is running on, check how much data you have in it, and we can make recommendations to make sure it's running in its optimal form. So again, if you want more information, you can go to our website in this link down here. These are what we offer from a customer success perspective. Now, does this actually make a difference? I would say yes. Right now, when we look at customers that have used our workshops and things like that, those customers that engage us renew at a 98% rate. And for the software industry, a renewal of 98% is very high. It's really high. And if you renew, that means that you are being successful, right? There's no single measure to judge whether you're successful or not by renewals. Because if you renew, it means you see value. It means that you recognize what the tool is allowing you to do and how it's helping your organization, and you say, yes, I definitely want to invest in this again. So definitely get us involved, and we'll help you with your success. So I've gone through 5 steps, and I lied. I actually have one more step, a bonus step, if you will. And before I get into that step, I'm going to pose the question, is there such thing as a steady state? When we talk internally in the customer success team, sometimes we've talked about getting a customer to a steady state. And sometimes we have discussions of if there is such a thing. A steady state, people think, okay, it's up and running, it's doing what it needs to do, it's providing value to the company, now it's just a matter of keeping the lights on. Well, that doesn't really happen in real life, right? Because my bonus step, or step number 6, if you will, is to embrace change, right? Change is going to happen, and it happens in organizations all the time. Whether you decide to embrace in a digital transformation, whether your company decides that they want to shift left, whether they want to embrace DevOps, there's always change in leadership, change in markets that you want to focus on. So there's always going to be change in the organization, and that may mean you need to change how you use our products. For example, you might have been using Nexus repository for Java, and now you are going through a containerization movement. So now you're going to have to use Nexus to store Docker images, to proxy Docker Hub. You may want to containerize Nexus itself. In Nexus Lifecycle, you have your policy set, but now there's new policies. Maybe now you're doing distributed applications, which you weren't doing before. So now you need to make sure that you are recognizing that in your policies. So things are always changing. So to say that you're going to be in a steady state, I think that's a false notion, because things are always changing, and it's good to embrace change. Otherwise, people are going to resist it, and that's just going to create friction. But by embracing change, you'll be able to roll with the punches, if you will, and contribute to your success. So I know I'm a little early, but again, I appreciate everybody's time. I hope you have found this presentation helpful in guiding you through the steps that we commonly see customers follow to be successful with your deployments. I will be going on to the Slack channel and happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I'll be happy to join you in the Slack with any questions. If you always can reach us by emails. If you're one of my customers, of course, you know how to get a hold of me. You know my email address and my phone number. So we can definitely talk about any other things you may want to do to ensure your success. But definitely get engaged. To review, the steps are, number 1, define your primary desired outcome. Make sure that you define that. It's very important to know what that is and to keep that in mind as you go through the journey. Number 2, define your success at each point, at each phase of your journey. Make sure you define the success. Make sure you are, now to step 3, make sure that you're measuring as you go through each step, and that allows you to know how you're improving and set those goals for the next phase. Number 4, as you achieve each of those phases, celebrate those successes and socialize those successes. It allows you to recharge your batteries. It allows you to improve morale and keep you going through the journey. And number 5 is to engage internally with the right stakeholders, involve everybody that's going to be involved in your deployments, and also get involved externally, whether it's the Nexus user conference, local user groups like DevOps Days, make sure that you're involved, you learn from your peers, and know what's been successful for others that you can then implement into your own organization. And of course, lastly, is to embrace change, because change is inevitable. Inevitable. Sorry, it's a word I have a hard time with. So you might as well embrace it because it's going to make it easier. So with that, I am finished, and I will go over to Slack. Marc,
sure,
are you?
thank you, Fernando. Hold on just a second.
Sure.
There was some interesting stuff here I want to dig a little deeper into. Brianne, welcome. I see that you're here too. So if you have something for Fernando, you can jump in and ask too. But one of the things that I thought was critical that you talked about was the idea of how important it is to talk with peers. That a lot of us, because we're isolated, we feel that we're in this thing alone. But you touched on the idea that there's a lot of peer discussion that can happen that can really surface a lot of stuff.
Yes, I found that to be the case, and again, as I saw in my bio, I've worked for other software companies, and I see that commonality on all software companies is that with customers, right? Is that talking to your peers, especially those that have already gone through what you're about to go through, it really helps you to learn from their mistakes, get insights on what they have to do, and especially when they're in the same type of vertical that you're in. So if you're in a highly regulated industry, whether it's medical or financial or any other type of highly regulated industry, it's very useful to talk to other peers that work in other highly regulated industries, because they may find the same challenges that you're facing today. And you can ask them, how did they overcome those challenges? Was it an organizational change? Was it a technical thing that they had to do? So what did they do to get over those hurdles, those challenges imposed by the various compliance and red tape that they have to adhere to? So I find it very important that you should talk to your peers, whether it's and online user conferences like this, but I also think local user groups where you get to talk face to face with your peers and have those connections and build your network, because while you might not have a question during that presentation or that user group, 3 months from now you may have a challenge. So being able to reach out to your network that you have worked on and be able to ask them questions is very helpful and will help you get over those hurdles.
It's critical. I've actually seen that myself too. One of the things that we have the ability to do is to reach out to our peers in the industry, which I think is great. But most people don't think of it as building the network the way that you thought about it. And I think that's good. It would be so appropriate for people to reach out and just invite some of their peers to lunch.
Yep.
I mean, I've done that. I live in New York City, so it's kind of easy to reach out to the people because there's so many different groups there. But in general, let's say that you're in the finance industry. You can reach out to your peers and say, hey, can 3 or 4 of us just get together for lunch and have a good conversation? I don't think I've had anybody turn that down, because you're not pitching anything, you're not selling anything. What you're trying to do is find level ground.
Right, and everybody likes to talk to their peers, right? I mean, when you're peer-to-peer, everybody likes to learn from each other. And one thing that I found out is that everybody likes to show off what they have done. I think it's just human nature. So people love to tell you how they were able to implement this, what they were able to do. I have many customers, when I've visited customers, they love to sit down with me and show me, the script that they wrote to automate this, or how they were able to overcome this by doing that. And that can also talks back to the celebrating part, right? When you do something that's good, it's always good to celebrate it. And you can celebrate it by sharing that with other peers in your network.
Great, thank you very much. If you head to the Slack room,
okay,
and make sure that you upload your slide deck there. People are going to want to see your slide deck.
Sure, I will do that.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. Brianne, welcome.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Speaking about celebrating, you got a lot of stuff to show today. You guys have been working hard on the educational material.
We have, yes. Well, everyone at SonoType has, but our team in particular, yeah, we've been doing a lot of work.
Okay, the other thing people are going to want to know is where do they get one of those shirts that you have on?
Jeffrey Hesse? I don't know.
Every
that's,
time
that's
people...
where I got it. Jeffrey's Hotel Room? That sounds weird.
That's the
Anyway.
Iron Maven. I'm going to get one of those for DJ Sleen. DJ has asked numerous times, so I'm going to have to get to Jeffrey and get one of those. So welcome. Thanks. Where are you physically today?
I am in Somerville, Massachusetts, outside Boston, across the river.
All right. Very cool. Very cool. And give us a 30-second overview. What are you going to cover?
We are going to talk about the new customer education team and what we're working on, how it's going to help you be better at your job, and then to go over all the other resources that SonoType provides for our customers.
Excellent. If you'll share your screen, we'll get out of your way and you can get started.
Okay. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Oops, hold on. Okay. Now?
I see myself yet. If you, there you go, and put that in presenter mode and we should be good. You're set to go.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, so this is Objective Learning, educational resources to make you a Kickass Nexus user. We'll do introduction first. Kind of already did that, but anyway, I'm Bree, and I'm a content developer on the customer education team here at SonoType. Over the next 20-ish minutes, we're going to talk about what our team is doing to help make you a Kickass Nexus user. Our team has been working for the past 8 months or so, redefining our model to focus on the success and happiness of our customers and creating the tools you need for that success. So at the end of this session, I hope you'll walk away with some important knowledge, like who the customer education team is at SonoType and why we're a thing. We're going to talk about our new approach to customer education and obstacles we're trying to overcome and goals we're trying to accomplish. I hope you'll also find out the kinds of educational materials that are out there, what we've made and where to find things on our new learning site. And like I said, we're also going to go over our pretty good range of resources from support, online help, community, and so on. And then finally, putting that together with how that's going to help you kick ass at your job. You'll discover how our new model is focusing on user education and making sure you can use Nexus to get your job done. At the end of this talk, we're going to do a short exercise that will give you an opportunity to influence what we work on next. And one quick shout out, if anyone is familiar with Kathy Sierra and her amazing work with user experience, yes, this title of this presentation is a nod to her book, and you should check her out if you don't know who that is. Okay, so who are we? As I previously mentioned, customer education is a newly formed team. We're part of the customer success team here at SonoType, and we moved from the product over to customer success. And the reason for that was to take on a new endeavor and transform ourselves from simply writing docs to writing value-based content. But what does that mean? It means that we discovered that there's a real need for value-added customer education. And to do this, we had to shift our focus from the product to the customer. So we have gone from checking the box, writing product feature-based help content, which is great, by the way, and has its place in overall customer education, to focusing more on how we can help our users get the most from our products. Creating this type of value-added content means that we can inform and educate our users to give them actionable knowledge they can use to get their jobs done. So we talked about the customer education team and why we're a thing and what we're doing, but next we need to define what a Kickass Nexus user looks like. So this might be a bit of a shocker, but being a Kickass Nexus user does not mean that you are a super Nexus expert who knows our products in and out and every feature that's out there. You really don't have to be Kickass at using Nexus repository or Lifecycle or firewall, because that's not what it's about. It's you want to be Kickass at your job, and you use our products because you want to be awesome at getting things done. So for us, a Kickass Nexus user is someone who knows exactly how to use our products to do exactly what they need. And this means that a Kickass Nexus user varies from organization to organization and role to role, but the bottom line is that you've been provided with the materials you need to use Nexus products for your specific needs. So we're focusing on how we can help you be better at getting things done in your job. We can write all the functional documentation we want, but that might not help you get your job done. So the customer education team is looking at making you better at using our products to do the things you really want to do. For example, instead of just showing you the steps to connect your LDAP to IQ Server, we'll teach you how to decide on the best approach to user authentication and authorization for your organization. Instead of just going through the steps to set up a repository manager, we'll provide tips on how to choose the right setup, configuration, etc., for optimal performance. Instead of just showing you how to find reports on vulnerabilities found in Lifecycle, we'll show you how to enforce policies to start enacting real change. And if you're a developer, instead of just knowing how to find the component information panel in your IDE, we'll demonstrate how to use that information to remediate vulnerabilities without leaving your dev environment. All of these examples are ways that you can be Kickass at your job by using our products effectively and efficiently for your specific purpose. So what problems do we need to solve to make this type of value-based content to help you use Nexus at your job? The main issue that we have, like basically anyone that writes customer documentation, is that we have a faceless user. Our content, everything we produce, is placed online for our users to interact with at their leisure. And we don't get to know who you are, how you're using our materials, what you think about what you see, and so on. In other professions, people are able to look at their outcomes to measure their work. For instance, lawyers can look at wins versus losses, teachers evaluate grades and student progression, and cops can look at open versus closed cases. But we're not there with you while you're learning, so we don't get these kinds of advantages. And this basically means that we really don't know if what we're producing is any good. So then how do we give you a face? In order to overcome this hurdle of a faceless user, we have to construct who you are using the means that we have available, like analytics, surveys, certifications, badging, support tickets, community, customer success engineers interactions, and try to get all the knowledge we can from these interactions with our customers on all these levels, and then apply that knowledge that we've gained to give you a face. Being able to build a face for our users means that rather than writing in a vacuum, assuming that what we do is valuable and then sending it up to the ether, we'll be able to define return on investment for each piece of content we develop based on who our users are and what they need. We'll then be able to ask ourselves for all materials, is this valuable and is that value measurable? Once we know who you are and what you want, the next step is ensuring that what we've made is working for you. So some ways that we're focusing our content to be value added are through learning objectives and assessment-based learning. Learning objectives. So our team has learned to really value the importance of learning objectives. We kind of love them. Why? Because they allow you to determine what you want people to walk away with when they use your content. I'm not going to get into a lecture on Bloom's taxonomy of learning, but I did make this fancy graphic, so we'll talk about it in a non-pedantic kind of way. Basically, Bloom's taxonomy is the model we're using to write learning objectives that describe the skills and abilities we want our learners to master and demonstrate. The model goes from the bottom up on cognitive skill level, calling attention to learning objectives that require a higher and higher level of skills. This is supposed to lead to deeper learning and transfer knowledge and skills to more tasks. So the first level is remembering, which just means that you recall what you learned. Second is understanding, when you can explain, interpret, summarize, etc., what you've learned. Next is applying, and when you get to this level, you're able to apply what you learned and execute a task or implement a method. After that is analyze, and here you're able to differentiate what you've learned with other topics and then organize that information. Fifth is evaluation, and when you evaluate, you're able to check and critique the learning objectives with what you learned. And the last step is create, and when you get to this highest level, learners should be able to plan, generate, produce, and perform some sort of action based on what they've learned. But why is this important, and why do we love them so much? Objectives or learning goals are important to establish up front so that our users understand the purpose of any given piece of content. And for our team, the customer education team, the benefits from using this as a framework to organize our content and ensure that what we're making aligns with these objectives. So in a sense, defining well thought out learning objectives shapes everything we make. In addition to learning objectives, we're doing assessment-based learning. And so while you're reading something or watching a video, you're learning. And in this act of learning, you gain knowledge, skills, work habits, etc. And then you're able to apply all of that to real-world situations. Assessment-based learning via quizzes, tests, certifications, badging provides a way for you to apply your knowledge, skills, and work habits that you learn by performing tasks that are meaningful and engaging. Remember that in our learning objective model, we want you to get to a point where you're able to analyze, evaluate, and then take some form of action based on what you've experienced. So assessment-based learning helps you take that first step by thinking critically about the subject you just learned. So this is why we provide assessments for each lesson that we're writing to give you the opportunity to test out your knowledge. And in the future, we're looking at implementing certifications and badging through our learning, and implementing a badge-based learning system for certification would let our users get recognition for their exemplary skills as a Nexus user. And that type of self-guided system is also shown to help you stay motivated to learn more and promotes a positive learning culture. So if you're interested in a certification or badging system for our products, please go to our community site and take the survey posted under the topic Customer Education, how we can help you. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Okay, so what have we made so far? So far, the customer education team has made a repository management basics module, and this is 3 lessons, all that have assessments. And then there's also a lab in the form of a repository planning worksheet. These also have embedded videos for them. So speaking of the videos, we have produced 20-ish educational videos. I should have counted them all, but I didn't. These videos are embedded in the lessons, and also they're available on the separate video page here if you just want to look at those. We've also done some technical articles like this IQ Slack webhook integration guide that shows you how to use webhooks to push a policy evaluation event up to Slack. And then there's some quick start guides, Nexus Firewall for Repo OSS, Nexus Lifecycle, Nexus Firewall, and you can find all this stuff at help.sonotype.com/learning. So you've seen what we made so far, and why we're making it, but what are we working on next? So in active development, we have a Nexus Repository Manager proof of concept installation and setup module. And this is nearly ready to go out. And it takes on the same format as our Repo Basics course with all the same assessments and videos embedded in it. We're also working on an AWS Quick Start Guide for Repository Manager 3 and also an IQ Server authentication and authorization technical article that will show you how to help getting started with LDAP and reverse proxy and other types of auth in your org. After that, and down the line, we're going to start working on an article that highlights the CI/CD pipeline at SonoType and how you can use that as an example. Repository Manager Deployment Module, it'll be the next module that we go on our series, complete with the lessons, assessments, and videos. And then our first admin certification, or our first certification will probably be repository administration. That is TBD. So we've talked a lot about our new learning center and what you can find there, but there's also a bunch of other great educational resources available from SonoType. So we'll check those out now. So the first amazing resource we have is our help documentation, and you can find it at help.sonotype.com. There is a ton of information on Nexus Repository Manager and IQ Server, which is the brains behind Lifecycle and Firewall, and all of the Nexus integrations in these help docs. And these can also be accessed in product from Lifecycle and Nexus Repo. So the help docs are where you want to go to download the latest version of our products, look at release notes, or get step-by-step guidance on basically anything you're trying to do with Nexus products. For instance, if you need to know the steps to take to upgrade from Nexus Repo 2 to 3, or how to configure your IQ server, this is where you want to go. We also have some great new educational platforms being developed by our customer experience team. They've created My SonoType and the SonoType online community. My SonoType is your go-to place for everything SonoType. Seriously, all the resources we're talking about today, you can get to from there. So this gives you links to the community, our help site, the learning site, with our educational materials, and also customer support. You'll also see any important customer announcements, like letting you know about this conference. And then there's links to download the latest releases of our products with the release notes, and finally the latest from the SonoType blog. And all of that is available at my.sonotype.com. The SonoType community is a brand new online community for Nexus users, and we're hoping you will gain the knowledge and benefits of a Nexus forum where you can exchange ideas and tips or ask questions and connect with other Nexus users and SonoType folks. And you can access this community at community.sonotype.com. Okay, so after that, we also have some great educational resources from our support team, SonoType Marketing, and the Nexus Exchange. So our amazing support team writes and maintains the support knowledge base in addition to all the other amazing work they do. And they have a ton of technical articles out there that will help you with some common and not so common issues. You can get to that at support.sonotype.com. And the Nexus Exchange is a really cool place where you can go for community contributions to Nexus Repository Manager. And that site is available at exchange.sonotype.com. And then finally, you should also check out the SonoType blog for announcements and information about our products and also the DevSecOps community as a whole. There's a lot of great blog posts there, and you can access that at blog.sonotype.com. Okay, so now you know what the customer education team is making, and that you can find it at help.sonotype.com/learning. And you also know all about the many customer support and educational resources offered by SonoType. After this presentation, go check all these out and get to learning. But remember that you can also access all these resources, I think all of them, from mysonotype.com. So go ahead and bookmark that one. It's a good one. But before you do that, let's hear from you. Oh, whoops, that link worked. There we go. So at the beginning of this presentation, I said we wanted to know what you want to learn. After that, we talked a lot about how important it is to put a face on our users. And this is because feedback is the #1 driving force behind our value-added content. So now it's your chance to get in on the action. We're going to do a quick and easy exercise. I want everyone to think about their experience with our products, what you love, what you hate, what you'd add, what you'd change, whether you're new or a pro, whether you're an admin or a dev. If you have an idea of what you'd like to see as far as education, then think about it for a minute. Okay, well, that was just 5 seconds, not a minute. But when you're ready, go to the new SonoType community site and post your idea as a reply to the community topic, how we can help you. I'll post a link to it. That's one link, but anyway. You can also just add your topic to the Slack customer success channel after this if you want to. If you want to provide more detailed information, you can complete the survey that's linked in the community topic, because we love your input on what we should do next. So please take a minute or two to let us know. I'm going to put all these links in the Slack channel after this. Okay, that's all I have for today. To quickly sum up what we went over, being a Kickass Nexus user is about giving you the right tools to be awesome at your job. And the SonoType customer education team is working hard to know who you are and create value-based Nexus content to help you get your job done. In addition to the learning site that we work on, SonoType has a bunch of other resources to help you learn about and use our products. And we want to know what you want. So please tell us what you want to learn. Go to the community site to take our survey or post an idea of what you'd like to know about. You can also reach out to our team directly anytime. We're education@sonotype.com. And that's all I have.
Great, thank you, Bree. A couple questions for you here.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of resources that you just listed. I mean, I'm astounded at about what we have. There's what I would think, though, is you would think about people at different levels. Where would a beginner start as opposed to somebody who has had some experience with the product? Where would they go? So talk about the different levels of users that would use these types of resources.
Well, I mean, I guess the help documentation and the learning site that we're working on right now is very much for new users. That's who we're focusing on. So I would say definitely go there, but then that's for our modules. But then we also have the more technical articles that we write for advanced users. So I would say the learning site and also our help documentation are both great resources for experienced and new users. But definitely, more experienced users will probably get more out of the help site because it assumes that you have a certain level of knowledge. Like when you look at any topic on there, it doesn't give you a backstory or, you know, prerequisites. So I would say the learning site is probably best for new users. And
then the one that David Rudolph is very high on now, the head of customer success, is the my.sonotype.com site. That is a whole, almost a portal. Talk a little bit about the history and how that came about.
I'd have to ask Nick the history about why it came about, but I mean, I think it came about because we needed a portal. We needed something to consolidate all of these resources that are out there. So that's what I was saying. If you just bookmark, you know, everything we talked about today, if you just bookmark mysonotype.com, you're going to be able to get to all of it. So I think guessing it came about for the need.
Great. Well, thank you. If you'll go into the Slack channel for people that have questions, and you can upload your slide deck there too, and that'll
Okay.
keep you going. And do people know how to get a hold of you if they need to? I guess you
think
can
so.
do that in the Slack. You can put that in there.
Yeah, I'll put all the links that I talked about in the Slack channel.
Hey, great. All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Chris, how are you, Chris? I'm going to bring you back in here.
I'm doing awesome. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. We're a little bit early this morning, which is fine. We can discuss the weather, or we can talk a little bit about, have you been able to watch any of the sessions today or yesterday?
I have been. It's a bit early in the morning for me on the West Coast, but they've been great so far. So really enjoying them. So I'm looking forward to rewatching some of the ones I missed yesterday, and then getting Carlucci's this morning. I saw a little bit of it as I was getting prepared in the morning, but yeah, it's great. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, the content, again, even as we're growing as a company, I didn't realize all the stuff that customer success was involved in now. It's pretty amazing what you guys are doing.
Right. Yeah, I'm really excited about the community project. That's something that's been in the work for since I got started. They've been talking about it, and to see it actually come together now, I know it's going to be a great resource for our customers. It's going to be a great resource for customer success, so that way we can actually connect directly with it. We've had similar starts and stops trying to do a similar thing internal. This is really great that we're going live with it, and we're going to be able to work directly with our community to get rolling with Nexus products and sharing that knowledge with them. So,
was that the most exciting thing you saw about Bree's presentation?
That's the one I've been anticipating the most. Breeze, having the customer education team come to customer success has been really great, because I feel like they're for a long time our docs had needed some love, and to see that the company's embracing that and bringing in this team, and then working with us, customer success, who is really hand in hand with our customers. We deal with them on a daily basis, and so we see what questions they're asking, things they need, and to have us respond now with the customer education team coming on board, putting together lessons. It's going to be very valuable onboarding. I know it's going to make my job a lot easier, so I'm very excited about that. Yeah, it's been good. Her presentation was spot on.
Great. How long you been with the company?
About 2 years now, a little bit more than that. So it's amazing how quickly it's grown. Even our team, we've doubled, tripled. So it's neat seeing all the new faces, and I feel like I'm finally knowing how to use the product really well, that I can talk about it in an effective manner. So yeah, it's really exciting being a part of the SonoType team.
It has been a remarkable year. We went to the engineering summit 2 or 3 weeks ago, and to stand in the middle of that room when even 2 years ago there's only 25 or 30 people, and then there was 120 people there.
Right. Yeah. Unbelievable. So we're growing out of that space too. I think we're gonna have to go outdoors somewhere. We won't fit in that room anymore. So that would actually be a nice change of pace to be able to spread our wings and walk around somewhere instead of the stuffy halls. So our user group conferences, or our product meetup, has been a really great experience. Just for seeing a bunch of engineers in one place with all the ideas. So very, very exciting.
There's a lot of quirky personalities in that room.
Right, and the gaming at night is a lot of fun too. So we start pulling out the D&D boards and different games, and so it's a lot of fun.
Great. All right, Chris, good to catch up. Why don't we get you set up and get you going here? So share your screen.
I actually might close my window too, because it sounds like they just started to mow the lawn. So let me share the screen, and I'll get going on that.
All right, sounds good. I'll be here if you need me.
Great, thanks. All right. And it's a beautiful morning out here in San Diego, but I probably don't want to hear the lawnmower all day. So, okay, so welcome. Again, I'm really glad to be here and sharing with you. I'm going to discuss the reference governance policies that we have in the IQ server. So just probably you've heard it, but a brief primer. Our IQ server is a highly customizable on-premise solution. It's the policy engine that powers our Lifecycle, our firewall, and our auditor products. It's also the endpoint that's used to communicate with our data services. So all of the results from your scan reports are displayed in the IQ server, and that's where your developers would go to remediate their security issues. So whether you're just discovering that you're using open source for the first time, which does happen, or you've already have a component vetting process embedded in your software pipeline, building that organization's open source governance policies from scratch can be really complex and labor-intensive process, right? And so that's why in IQ Server we have a complete set of reference policies that are going to help get you a head start. So we'll be reviewing these out-of-box policies and learning how to make them better work for your organization. So let's get moving. So a quick introduction. This is a picture of me sitting on the beach out here in San Diego. But I've been in customer success for the last 2 years, and I work out of Southern California. All of our customer success engineers are remote, and so we're distributed to hopefully be in a location that we can better help our customers. In previous jobs, I've worked for small businesses wearing many different hats, from like software design to database administration and management. So one of the more challenging tasks that I had was actually training our sales team on new software tools for that our IT department would deploy. Oftentimes, I would have to take very complex tasks and then break them down into simple ways that even somebody from sales can understand. And this kind of experience kind of prepared me well for the CS role, customer success role, as we navigate our customers through similar challenges, even though they're much more capable students. So building on that capability, we're going to skip the part where I define what open source is and open source governance and the risks that are associated with those open source projects. We're assuming that you know that. There are much better sources out there for these kinds of topics where you can spend more time learning about it. I know both Jerry and Chris Carlucci went over those, and those are great videos that you might want to review at a later date. So other quick recommendations on getting started with open source security. You can check out the NVD, National Vulnerability Database. There's the URL, as well as the OWASP Foundation, where you'll find resources on how to understand security concerns and navigate through those. For OSS licenses, you can check out the Open Source Initiative, which you'll find a number of resources there. I also found a web series on YouTube called the Upstart Workshop by Todd Harris. You could just Google that or follow that link. He does a really good job of explaining open source licenses and then understanding copyleft requirements. Otherwise, you can also check in with Jerry's talk earlier, where he did go through a really good job working through that. So those are some resources to get started. So let's jump into our discussion. So yeah, actually one last quick note on the reference part of our name. While these out-of-box policies are really good and they work well for our customers, most of our customers actually use them for a foundation for their own governance policy. They're really meant to be a reference for you, and you need to determine your own policies for your organization. So, by providing these in the software, we are helping to build a baseline of your risk and give you a guide to creating your own policies. But they really shouldn't be construed as legal advice or guidance, and you should review them fully before implementing them as your de facto organization's governance policies. So for more assistance on actually creating your governance policy, you can check out the Lifecycle policy workshops that Fernando is mentioning, and I'll also make a plug for that at the end of this discussion. So one of the coolest features of our policy engine is the amount of flexibility you have in creating policies, right? And those are dependent upon your organizational's, organization group priorities. So for instance, like your security team is going to focus more on security vulnerabilities in the open source that you use, whereas the legal department is going to be much more concerned with the license issues associated with those components. And this is why we group our reference policies into 3 key governance priorities. And these are security vulnerabilities, license issues, and architectural concerns. So each policy name is prefixed with one of these segments, one of these 3 segments, security, license, and architecture. And then each one of those groups is further broken down and ranked by a severity level or threat level. And that's to help you visualize the policy violations, which policy violations have the highest priority, and where your development should actually focus their efforts in your organization. So that's going to be reflected in the report. Since security policies are the most straightforward, we're going to just jump right into those now. Okay, so our security data team uses the CVSS from the NVD as the model for scoring vulnerabilities. They gather data from various sources, including, and this is a big long list, it's the NVD, website security advisories, email lists, GitHub events for all open source projects, blogs, OSS index, Twitter, and then even from customer reports, right? So you can learn more about that in our documentation. We have a whole section talking about our security team and how they get security data. It's a pretty fascinating story. So when that team discovers new vulnerabilities, though, that haven't been published from the NVD, and that happens quite often, they'll actually assign an internal CVE number, CVE ID, and then they'll score those vulnerabilities accordingly. And again, this is using the CVSS score that you see an example here from the NVD site. This allows us to actually create policy events that are based upon those CVSS scores, and then report those violations on identified components, right? And so let's take a look at what that looks like. So here's a couple examples. Up at the top here, I have a component. It's Access 1.2, and it has 3 security issues associated with it. The highest security threat on those issues is a CVSS of 5.8. That's probably a good place to start. If this component was scanned in your application, then you would have a policy violation of security medium, right, with a threat level of 7. So that's based upon the policy reference policies that we have. This violation will actually show up on the report as a orange threat. And again, this is wholly customizable by your security team. So it's important because it may not be as critical as other violations as well, right? So we're looking at this next one down here, Common Beans Util, which is version 1.6. This component has a vulnerability score of 7.5. Right, just one security violation, but it's a pretty severe one. And this flags our security high policy with a threat of 9. So this is going to be red. This is going to be in your developer's face. On the security application reports, they're going to see this as a priority. As the security team has dictated that this is what they should work for first, right, and remediate this issue. And again, this is all customizable when they're creating the policy sets in the IQ server. So this is an example here of the actual security high policy that's in the reference set. You can navigate to it by going to the organization policies menu. You can see that the conditions on this policy require that the security vulnerability severity, you'll see that down here in the middle, or CVSS score for the rest of us, that must be greater than or equal to 7, but then also less than 10, right? And this is why a vulnerability score or a CVSS score of 7.5 from the Commons Bean util will trigger this policy violation. You'll also notice that there's another condition in there. It's actually a mouthful to say. It's security vulnerability status is not applicable, right? So this condition is important because it allows us to actually have a remediation path built into our policies when a violation is not applicable for our application, right? Because of maybe our exposure surface is lower, or work that the development team has actually done to avoid the issue. So let me show you what that looks like next. So this would be the violation from the actual scan report. We can check the vulnerabilities tab of the component information panel, or CIP as we like to call it. You can see here, this is the Commons being util 1.6, and it's violating the CVE 2014-0114. So now we get this come up, but however, our cool devs have read this CVE info, right? They clicked on that info button and read through the work that our security research team has done, and they found a fix, right? They're going to apply a fix to the code. So they're going to comment here that they found that fix, and they're going to switch the status over to not applicable. So that way, the next time this application is scanned, that third policy condition down here is no longer met, right? So the status is not applicable. It is not applicable, right? If that makes sense. So the component will no longer fail this policy. So again, this gives us a way of remediating those issues and working through the list of vulnerabilities. So I will have a couple of notes here. First is that just because the application is no longer vulnerable, it doesn't mean that the vulnerability doesn't exist for this component, right? So that's still there. And that's why it will continue to show up in the securities issues tab that's up here. Right now, we're in the policy violations. It'll keep showing up for the application report. It's just going to no longer flag that policy violation. So that way, the developers, when they're going through the reports, it's not going to waste their time remediating or weeding through violations that are no longer applicable. Also, this may not always be the best way to deal with violations, right? So oftentimes, the actual open source developer will learn about the vulnerability and they'll release their own fix. And hopefully, they'll release the fix before the vulnerability becomes known. So upgrading to that latest version of the component is probably the most effective way to remediate it. And should be the primary path that your developers go through. So here's some more best practices for security. So you'll notice that if you check out the NVD, the latest CVSS version 3 rating now actually includes a critical severity rating that they haven't had previously. Our security reference policy has included this for some time. However, the alignment on the new score is different than our current reference policy. We might change that at some point, but that's kind of how it is right now out of box. So either because of this, or depending on what your own security team, your own governance policy dictates, you might want to adjust these, right, to better meet your organization's security risk tolerance. So you can do the adjusting by going to the security critical policy up here. And you know, in the actual policy itself, you would adjust it from a 10 down to a 9, right? And then that way it would include 9 and above, right? So that's going to include the 9 and 10. You just also want to make sure that you adjust the security high policy next and bring that from a 10 down to a 9. And then that way you're not getting an overlap in between those two policies. So you'll also notice at the bottom of this list, there's a security unscored policy. And we put that in place to catch the kind of infrequent situations when a reported vulnerability doesn't have a score assigned, right? So I believe that we've actually put in place that so this doesn't really happen anymore. But if you ever do get one, you know, the concern there is that the vulnerability might be bad or it might be worse. And without a score, you won't really know. And so if you do get one of these, just let support team know and they'll get it corrected. So let's move on to some license issues. So the reference policy for license builds upon the concepts that we've learned from the security policy, such as threat level and policy conditions, right? But it also is going to add 2 new concepts as well. I believe Jerry actually went over the license threat group a little bit, but we'll do that a little bit more. And we're also going to talk about application categories. So let's start with those license threat groups. Our data team has identified hundreds of licenses found in open source components, right? So lots and lots of them. To simplify the process of creating and managing your policies against those licenses, we leverage the concept of the license threat group, which is grouping those licenses together with similar obligations, right? So these are license obligations that you're concerned with for your organization. So you can create your own custom license threat groups or leverage the ones that we have, whatever is important to you. So the reference policy comes with this list of organization obligations. They're the banned, copyleft, non-standard, weak copyleft, and liberal license. There's also this SonoType special license. It's a special data quality group for when we're not able to determine what the license is on a component. You really don't need to worry about it much. Again, it's one of those things. If you see it come up, which should be rare, you just contact support and they'll make sure they update that component details as well. So a ton of work actually goes into identifying all those license obligations, right? And there goes the lawnmower. So classifying licenses into license threat groups, right? So I can't actually share those details with you here online because it's a little bit of our secret sauce. However, our legal team, if your legal team or when your legal team is ready to review this work, we do actually have an awesome tool that we can share with you that goes into the details about why licenses were classified into those different groups. You can get that tool by just reaching out to your customer success team, and we'll get it to you. So that's really exciting. So in this example here is the license banned threat group. You can see that these are licenses, again, as Jerry mentioned, that organizations find too restrictive to safely use in the code. So they just outright ban them in the organization across the board. They include things like the AGPL, which requires components to requires that if you use that component, you have to open source your entire application code, which can be pretty crazy. So on the left, you'll see a list, the left of the section. These are available licenses that can be selected and added to the group, the selection group on the right. The reference group are fully customizable. Again, you can move them back and forth. Security team can review it and kind of geek out over it. So it makes the process really easy. Again, we have basic groups that are already existing, but you can create your own threat groups based upon what your needs are. So another license threat group I want to talk about is the copyleft licenses. So these are the licenses that require you to open source your code if you distribute the application, right? So that's the key requirement. So theoretically, if you're using the components for an internal application only, it should be actually safe to use, and you won't have any negative obligations. That's again going to be up to your legal team to determine. The obligations only really kick in when the application is distributed. So in order to use this policy, you would want to scope it to only those applications, right? Only the applications that are going to be distributed. And this is where we're going to leverage that application category. And so only this policy will only apply to those applications that have been labeled with that distributed application. You can see in the inheritance section here when we're selecting it, that this policy will only apply to applications in that category. So for other applications that don't have this, this policy will just not be used. So again, our reference policy comes with 3 different application categories as a defaults. These are the distributed, hosted, internal. You can actually leverage the application categories to effectively tailor your policy based upon your own different organizational requirements. It's limited to licenses either. You can actually do this for security and architectural concerns as well. The reference policy set includes these basic ones, but you can adjust them, add new ones, remove them, change the color to make it whatever you want. And then the description helps your devs understand what that category is associated with. When you're actually assigning them to an application, you can assign one or more or none. So you have a lot of flexibility in how that's configured. So one best practice regarding the application categories is to not go crazy creating lots of categories for everything under the sun. While they can be useful for tagging applications with organizational metadata, too many categories may get difficult to manage in the long run. And they won't really provide much value to your teams. So the key thing here is to plan your requirements for policy to something simple and effective as possible, right? We see our customers spend a lot of time doing this, just getting it right. And so that's another point where you can reach out to the customer success team and we'll help guide you, provide guidance on this. So after you've used Lifecycle for a while and modified your license threat groups, or maybe just deleted all the licenses in the license threat group, you might see this policy violation show up in your scans. So this is the threat not assigned. This policy is letting you know that you have a license within your application that has not been assigned to a license threat group yet, right? So basically what that means is that license isn't going to hit any policy violation because it hasn't been determined what policy it's going to violate. So as we expand our language coverage, like our security team is adding more data and more components, we do send out updates about new licenses that get identified. But if you don't update your license threat groups, in case you've customized them, because we don't actually manually or we don't automatically do that for you, because we don't want to ruin the groups that you have configured. So you will have to actually add those licenses to those threat groups. And so, you'll get this violation that would show up. And once you do, you just add the license to the threat group. If you need help with that, again, let us know. So the final license issue that I want to bring up is this license modified weak copyleft. So these are licenses with a copyleft obligation, but they really only kick in if you make a change to that component, right? So changes to the open source, if you make a change, you actually have to send that back to the open source community as a whole. So we use this concept called the similar match condition for these licenses to determine if that component has been changed, and that will also fire the component similar policy. So let's jump into that one next. So the component similar is a policy that's flagged when the component has been modified from the original open sourced version, right? So since we don't actually see your source code, we don't know what kind of changes happen to this component. We just know that it's different in some way. So it's possibly that change isn't really a big deal, right? Maybe the developer compiled the project themselves on their own, or they downloaded it from some random website as opposed to like Maven Central, or they fixed the bug in it, right? There was a bug and they fixed it in the component, or they decided to add a crypto miner, whatever. So either way, the modified open source component is an actual risk to your organization, and it could involve unneeded tech debt to your application. So as a best practice, you want to use the official components from official repositories as much as possible, so that way you can avoid these risks. If you do decide to continue to use this component, you can assign a waiver to it and add a description of the changes that were made, as well as who to blame for allowing to go through. So we do allow you to track that in your application. So the component similar match is our first architectural concern. So let's jump into the other ones. So this next architectural concern here is this component unknown, which is when we don't recognize enough of the component to be confident in what it actually is, right? So as I mentioned, we don't look at source code. Instead, our scanners do a recursive fingerprinting of the binaries and the components inside the application. These are matched to an extensive catalog of open source components, so that way we can provide you with a bill of materials. The component might be unknown because we don't know what your source code is, or it could be vendor software that you have in your application, or something that's outside of our core supported languages. If you get one of these and you can identify the component directly in the CIP and then claim them, so that way they're accounted for going forward and you know what's in your software. So architectural concerns often take secondary priority to security and legal issues. They're highly varied based upon organizations, language that you use, and then the application categories that you might have, right? So the next two here are in our reference policy set, but they're mainly just for informational purposes. The architectural cleanup policy is an example of flagging text components, which should probably not be in your final application, and they could potentially pose unnecessary risk. So you'll get this when those components exist there. You can actually you see that they're tailored towards Maven, but you can set up coordinates for pretty much any other ecosystem as well. So you would just customize that based upon what your need is. The architectural quality policy focuses on additional metadata, such as the components of the additional metadata of the components, such as age and popularity, right? So old components may have newer versions available, and staying on those old components could add a tech debt to your system, right? So and now if there is no new versions available, it could be that the project is dead and it's no longer maintained. So any security vulnerabilities that could have been there are just not being notified and reported, and so that adds its own level of risk. So staying fresh on the latest components is important. So popularity is a concept. Since we're the stewards of Maven Central, we get to monitor download usage of components, and that gives us kind of intelligence onto what's popular and what's not, right? So the idea is if you have a component that's widely unpopular, there might be a reason why the community is not using it. So there could be some unnecessary risks associated with that. And again, your architectural team will decide what the priority is for that. So that's a quick tour of our reference policy sets. A couple of best practices to throw in at the end there is you make sure you document your policy. So whether you're using the reference set or you start making tweaks and changes on your own, the IQ server right now doesn't have a real good way of versioning your policy. That might be something that we do in the future. But for now, make sure you document it. Why did you make the changes that you did to it? And then that way going forward, when somebody's asking questions, they can see that. Or if you hose a policy, you know how to roll back to what is actually important to your organization. So we do highly recommend putting together that document. You can reload the reference policy. This is a dangerous thing to do. So because if you have application scans or you've done some work, reloading the reference policy will actually nerf everything, and that might be bad. So if you do need to do that and you want to just kind of hit the reset button, this link here will take you to our quick start guide where we talk about how you can load in the reference policy set, and it'll give you a JSON file that you can download for that. Enough people have talked about the available workshops. What we've talked about here is a little sampling of what we often do in our policy workshop, but that policy workshop is much more extensive. And so we definitely recommend going through that. You'll get a lot of value out of it. You can get a customer success agent to show up and actually help you do the work and understand this in your team. So, and again, feel free to email customer success. We're here to make you successful. And so we love talking to our customers and providing value. So, let us know what you think. So thanks. I think you're muted, Marc.
Yeah, I have 2 mute buttons just to be safe.
Just in case, right?
I think one of the things, if I'm following the patterns properly, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but a lot of people come to us initially because of what you just talked about, that it's a licensing and governance issue that they're looking at, right? And then what that does is it leads into the broader scope of security in the whole pipeline. But this is the entrance point, right?
That's right. Yeah. Quite often, organizations to us, and they have a very clear governance policy, and they want to move through getting that implemented into the IQ server and leveraging that. You know, the IQ server allows you to automate that policy across your organization. So, you know, there's a lot of power and flexibility there. We also see the other end too, right? Somebody's just starting out with DevOps and they don't actually have clear policies at all. And at that point, they're looking to us for some of that guidance. And you know, when we have our policy engagements, quite often we're sitting there explaining this process and then working with them to be able to tweak that reference policy to better meet their needs. So we put that in there because it's a best, you know, a lot of our customers have used that and we find that it works well. We do tweak it occasionally, you know, based upon changes of ecosystem and such, but you know, the latest version of IQ Server will have it. So, but at the same time, it really comes down to what's important to the organization. And the report, you know, just because something has a security vulnerability, it may not necessarily be that applicable to that organization. So the actual policy violations really just puts what's important in front of the developers, and they're not seeing a lot of spam. Because if it's not something that's important to them, they're just going to ignore it. And quite often, that's what happens with other tools.
All right. Thank you so much. Very informative session. Thanks.
Awesome. Glad to be here.
All right. Go hit the beach after you go to the Slack channel.
Right.
And dump off your slides and then talk to people. Hey, thanks.
It's an early day for me. So cheers. Thanks, Mark.
Sure. And for those of you still with us, this is our break time. Everybody needs a break. We're going to take a 45-minute break and come back at 1:30 East Coast time and start up all over again. I'll put a little note in the window here to remind you to go look at the schedule on sonotype.com. Look at the bottom of the entrance page there, and it's a direct link to the schedule for the day. So appreciate you coming. See you back either in this channel or the general channel at 1:30.